Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Sarah.
I'm Sarah Posner, and this is the Posner Show. And my guest today is Jeff Sharlet. He's an investigative journalist and fantastic writer, and he has a story in the February edition of GQ about homophobia and violence in Russia that is not only just stunning for its content, but it's just an amazing piece of journalism that I hope everybody reads, not just for it itself, but also for a better understanding of what is going on in the country that's hosting the Olympics that are starting this week. So, Jeff, first of all, congratulations on the story. It's, like I said, it's just an amazing piece of journalism. And you were able to go deep into both the world of LGBT activists and ordinary people in Russia, but also you went inside the world of these horrible thugs who, without any sanction from the state, it seems, inflict a lot of violence on gay people. It seems just like for fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Sarah. And it's always wonderful to be talking with one of my favorite investigative journalists. Um, and that last thing you said about the sort of the way these thugs operate without sanction, that was one of the most frightening things that I encountered.
Yeah.
And since I've been back from Russia, a lot of people have said, well, isn't it sort of like this, in some parts of the United States? And I don't want to take anything away from that. Certainly it is. I mean, it's like
Hmm.
this, some days it's like this in Manhattan. But it doesn't have that state sanction. It doesn't have um, these men who are videotaping their attacks
And putting them
on
online.
and putting them online. One of them has been arrested, but most of them have not. Most of these guys operate in clear view of the police, sometimes with the help of the police. Sometimes there's a video you can find online that's really frightening of one gay activist, a guy named Kirill Kalugin, in the middle of a square in St. Petersburg on National Paratroopers Day. And the paratroopers in Russia, there's not really a parallel for who they are in the U.S. military. National Paratrooper Day is a day when people hide inside while these guys get very drunk and very violent on the streets, and they're surrounding and knocking this young guy Kirill Kalugin back and forth, saying they just want to talk to him. These giant muscle-bound guys and this one lone protester. Eventually, the police arrest him to rescue him, and then when he gets in the back of the police car, they say, you know what we should do is we should dump you in the river. Um, so there's really nowhere to turn
Hmm.
for help except for themselves, and that's the sort of the hopeful part of the story is there are some really incredibly brave,
Right.
courageous, strong activists and ordinary people
Hmm.
fighting for their rights there.
So let's back up a little bit and talk about how things got this way in Russia. In the piece, you talk about, you say civil society isn't just coming undone there, it's imploding. And
Yeah.
you talk about not just the anti gay stuff that's going on, but the banning of books, the jailing of the Pussy Riot members, journalists getting killed, blasphemy has been made illegal. So this is part of a bigger phenomenon, but how in particular has Russia in recent years gone down this particular path with regard to homosexuality?
Well, this is that's a really important point because going down this road with regards to homosexuality, I think a lot of people in the West and some of the coverage, we tend to think of homophobia as a vestige of a bad old bigotry that's fading away. There's going to be
Hmm.
backlashes, but slowly it gets better. In Russia, it gets worse. In fact,
Right.
they used to be much better. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a real flourishing of gay life. It got quieter in the early years of Putin, but even then, I spoke to one guy. He's called Alex the Cop in his story. He's a police officer who recently resigned so wouldn't have to enforce laws against other gay
Right.
men. And he said the best time was 2010, that recently. And what really is a turning point is the 2012 re-election of Putin. Remember,
Mm-hmm.
Putin had been president, and then he had gone off to be prime minister, and now he's back to being president again. And uh, when he came back, a lot of people were dissatisfied. The oil money that had sort of financed his popularity wasn't quite as strong as it used to be. He had cleared out so much of the underbrush of civil society that, this is a whole nation. Well, Russians bowling is not popular there, but it was a whole nation of people bowling alone,
Mm-hmm.
and so there suddenly started to be this sort of political dissidence, and Putin realized he was going to need an internal enemy to distract them. And Elena Kostychenko is a great, great, brave activist and Russian journalist. Put it to me like this: he said, you've got to imagine Putin saying, "Okay, we've got an external enemy that can be the U.S." We need someone internal, and they're sort of looking around with Chechnya. No, we don't want to fight them again. We've already had enough trouble there. The Jews, no, the Jews are off limits now. And
Right.
the gays are the perfect solution. And this came at a time when the Russian Orthodox Church was ascendant and seemingly sort of very eager to trade a kind of goodwill it had among a lot of Russian people who weren't religious in order to wage a very American-style culture war. So
Well,
American-style that you would meet people, Russians, who didn't speak English, but when they would start talking about these fundamental issues, little bits of English like pro-life and traditional values would pepper their language because they were
that was
borrowing it
that
directly from the
that
U.S.
that's something that I wanted to ask you about because I know that here in the U.S. there are Eastern Orthodox religious figures who've aligned themselves with the Evangelical Catholic Alliance that's anti-gay and anti-abortion and anti-reproductive rights. And I know that the World Congress of Families is having its a meeting, I think this year, in the next few months in Moscow. And how much were you able to ferret out the influence of these American conservative groups on not just the Russian Orthodox Church, but perhaps other sectors of Russian society or politics?
The influence of the Americans is there, but it's not as direct as we see in some smaller developing nations like Uganda or Kenya,
Right.
where I've reported. And there you can see a big, rich American Christian right organization can go in and
Hmm.
practically do their own foreign diplomacy. Russia's not like that. It's bigger. It's very big. It's rich, and it's got a lot of pride. So the Russian Orthodox Church in particular, they're not particularly interested in these Orthodox evangelical alliances in America because the Russian Orthodox Church now is dedicated to such a fierce nationalism.
Oh, interesting.
The patriarch Kirill, who is
Hmm.
sort of the equivalent of the Pope, I guess you could say, of the Russian Orthodox Church. He calls Putin an act of God. He sees Putin or is at least willing to endorse Putin as a sort of a divine figure. And then you
And Putin
have,
doesn't try to. Putin likes this,
well, who doesn't want to be an act of God,
right?
Shocks me. But what was most interesting to me, and I think it's really important, um, is the ways in which these ideas, these sort of homophobic ideas from sort of American culture war, travel over to Russia, and a lot of attention gets paid to some sort of American fringe figures, like there's a man named Paul Cameron, and
Right,
Scott Lively,
right.
who we know have a bigger stature abroad. But that's not really what's going on there. And I think when I was in St. Petersburg, I attended a meeting of Narodny Sabor, which is sort of a umbrella group of umbrella organization of hundreds of national groups around the country, and was really one of the chief engines for getting these laws passed. And I was talking with the leader of the St. Petersburg branch, a guy named Anatoly Artu. And he said, "Look, I got all the data that I then passed on to the politicians. I mean, the social science, so to speak, that underlies these laws." He says it comes from the websites of the American Family Association, the Family Research Council, and so on. But what was interesting, and here was a man who was sitting. He was sitting in front of a czarist flag, and in front of him was a bouquet of flags from the American Confederacy that had been gifts to him by American friends. What was interesting was he said, "But I don't really know these people. I just find these numbers and this data online. I find these faux social science papers, and I used that to translate into Russian policy. Um, and because sitting right next to him were some pretty scary guys, also translates into Russian violence. But the key thing is it's the ideas that are traveling more than any particular organization or individual or activist. It's these
Right.
ideas. They're bad ideas, but they do
So,
have
but did
legs.
he recognize this as faux social science that he was cynically using to advance his agenda, or did he really think that it was legitimate social science that he was culling from the websites of these organizations?
You know, in the story, there's a point where I describe him. I'm asking him about an associate of his who I had met, and describing the story. There'd been a shooting at a local a gay activist sort of hangout, and a young man named Dmitry Chazivsky had been shot in the eye. And then I had met a right-wing activist who had accidentally showed me a picture of a gun like the one used, and it also turns out he had blueprints of where the shooting took place and surveillance photos. It all added up to an awful lot of circumstantial evidence. And I asked this man, the leader of the Narodny Sabor there, I asked him, you know, was this what it looked like? Was this kind of violence? And he did. There's a big guy. He's a big, sort of heavy-set guy, imposing guy. He sort of did what I thought of as a Tony Soprano smile, that pursed lip Tony Soprano smile you see when he's sort of acknowledging something. And he said, yes, no, you know, sort of right in between. And that was a little bit of his attitude toward the social science. They would present themselves very seriously, but in the end, it would always kind of collapse into a kind of a cynical laughter. There was a point one night with the right-wingers, and they'd been talking for so long and had worked themselves up into such a froth that soon gay became interchangeable with Jews. And the next thing I know, they're talking about the protocols of the elders of Zion and Henry Ford, and it just sort of went traveling back through decades, this sort of hate that just took on a new object. And they could dress it up in social science. I met a representative of the World Congress of Families that you mentioned there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's deeper and uglier. And from their perspective, weirdly funnier. They think they're funny than that. And that's what's really sort of most frightening, is that this horrible, horrible joke that they're telling now has the backing and the endorsement of one of the most powerful governments in the world.
Well, one of the things that I found really fascinating and terrifying about the piece was how you describe the view of Putin himself, it appears, and others in Russia, that homosexualism,
Yeah.
which I think is just broader than homosexual people, it's sort of like
They're framing it
word
as
for
an
the gay
ideology.
agenda.
Homosexualism is an
Yeah,
ideology.
yeah. So their version of the gay agenda or the homosexual lobby or whatever that religious right activists call it here is a threat to the nation's sexual sovereignty.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
sort of like this uber macho, uber nationalistic vision of what Russia is that they feel, and that they feel homosexualism threatens.
Yeah, yeah, and what's interesting there is there you see that sort of that's all part and parcel of the reactivation of the Cold War, and I think essential to understanding the rhetoric of this kind of this homophobic movement as it takes place in Russia is that they see this as a war with America. Homosexualism, the ideology, comes from America. The disease, from their perspective, the disease and the cure, the homosexual agenda and the warped social science they use to fight it. All of that comes from America. And they're very explicit about this. They say, you know, America is lost, but it's not too late in Russia. We can change things. So for the true believers, this plays right into their ideas about nationalism, about purity. For Putin, it's a wonderful distraction from the astonishing corruption of his regime, from the increasing inability of his regime to provide a kind of sort of middle-class life for a lot of Russians. He can say, look, we're fighting an enemy from without. And what's interesting, you know, one of the things that's sort of astonishing for anyone who knows any sort of World War II history or Russia history is the common everyday presence of neo-Nazis.
Really?
And to encounter a Nazi, I mean, a neo-Nazi anywhere is a revolting thing, and it's surprising. But in Russia, this country that lost 20 to 30 million people fighting these Nazis. What's going on? I spoke to one, a gay school teacher, had a number of neo-Nazi students. They didn't know he was gay. He wouldn't have his job if they did. And I asked him how this is, and he says, well, you have to understand, the Russian history books have been rewritten, and it's no longer so much the war against fascism as it was a war against Germans, and just another nationalist war. So Nazism, which used to be fascism, which was the enemy without, has been replaced by homosexualism as the front line of this kind of decadent invasion by America, which means we have to be really careful when we talk about this, because otherwise we end up playing right into that Cold War rhetoric.
Right. So the law in Russia bans, it's like an anti quote unquote propaganda law that bans gay propaganda. But what does that mean? And I mean, I think that there's the law, and then there's the lawlessness that's uh, in the lawlessness that's basically permitted by the law and the legal authorities. But what is the law used to actually proscribe?
Everything and nothing, the way I put it in the story is that the sort of, hate has three faces in contemporary Russia,
Hmm.
and the state is the head. The church, unfortunately, has become the heart of this hate. And then these sort of lawless characters, these thugs, they are the hands, they are the fists. And all these things are working in concert, but to what end? Because you're right, the law is so vaguely worded. It seems like like they resuscitated Article 70 from the old Soviet Union, which also banned propaganda and didn't define it very well, so that propaganda was whatever the state said it was. Um, and
And
here,
in this case, it's whatever the state and the thugs say it is.
well, exactly, and it's especially what the thugs say. And one of the things that's been most disturbing about responses in the West is we've seen a number of apologists, even liberal apologists, who first of all declare that they're horrified by the law, but really let's not get too excited about it because there's only been 3 prosecutions. This reveals a kind of sort of rank ignorance
Hmm.
about how these laws work, whether it's in Russia uh, or Uganda or for that matter, Alabama. Anti-gay laws are not designed to be enforced. They're designed to terrorize, to push
Hmm.
people back into the closet. The law is enforced not when the police barge into a room. That happens sometimes. It happened to me while I was there.
Right.
Um, it happens when thugs beat up somebody. It happens when someone's going to work and they find someone standing outside with a camera. It happens when they decide to hide their identity after being out for years because they're afraid they'll lose their children, they'll lose their job, they'll lose everything. That means the law has been enforced. And I think that's a really key thing we have to remember when we look at this. You put the law on the books so that you don't have to enforce it. A man
Right.
named Dmitry Anteo, who's a sort of a rising star Orthodox activist, head of an organization called God's Will, which is sort of a would-be Pussy Riot of the right. He says he's into action art. His action art tends to be rather violent. He says, I think we should go further. I think we should have the death penalty for homosexuality. He says, of course, we would never have to enforce it. He says, I wouldn't actually want to kill anybody, but we wouldn't have to. We just must make them afraid.
Right. One of the, I mean, the whole piece is disturbing, but one of the most disturbing moments was when you described how some of these thugs brought their children
Yeah, yeah.
with them to terrorize gay people. I mean, these kids were as young as what, 12?
Yeah, 12, 13-year-old boys. This happened last year at one of the kiss-ins outside the Duma. This wonderful Russian activist and journalist, Elena Kostyachenko, had organized as a protest. She was sick of these protests where you raise your sign and your flag and you immediately get beaten down. That had happened to her. At her first demonstration, she raised her rainbow flag for about 30 seconds before she was hit so hard that she suffered some really severe damage. She had to spend a lot of time in the hospital. She still doesn't have hearing on one side completely. So she said, if I'm going to get hit, I want to get hit doing something I like. And what does she like doing? She likes kissing her girlfriend. So they decided to have these kiss-ins, really wonderful events. And every kiss-in, of course, would be attended by an even bigger crowd of counter-protesters. And at one of these kiss-ins, the weapon that the counter-protesters came up with was to sort of take their children and have their children attack the kissers. Because, of course, who's going to hit a child? Who's going to strike back against a child? And I think they also wanted to emphasize that, from their perspective, homosexuality is dangerous to children.
Right.
And it was it's just sort of a heartbreaking thing to contemplate. In fact, my translator was an activist himself, Zhenya Belyakov, who's open about using his name. He had a difficult time translating this for me. And he's a tough guy.
Mm-hmm.
But it was one step too far. And it was sort of a moment where he turned away sort of very quietly and had to cry for a little while. And I think that's, this goes right to that kind of cliche we have in the West. It gets better, and we like to think everyone knows 12 and 13-year-old boys can be, at times, nasty. Not your son, but they can be mean to one another. They can be cruel, and the hope is that they'll get better. And the hope is that they'll get better
Right.
because their parents will teach them. And here, their parents are teaching a whole new generation of violence, of hate, and fear.
So there are no legal consequences for the thuggery, right?
There are. I don't want to go that far. So, for instance, there's a guy named Taysak, which is sort of roughly translated as maybe machete, who's the head of a network called Occupy Pedophilia.
Which turns like it's not really like the Occupy movement in other parts of
No, they just sort of thought
world.
people like this name Occupy, so
Right, they appropriated it. Okay.
And he was inspired. So he was inspired by the Occupy movement in a perverse sense, and he
Right.
was inspired by the American TV show To Catch a Predator, where they sort of put out ads pretending to be kids, and then the
Right.
sexual predator comes up, gets arrested. So what they did is they would seek out gay men, and then they would interrogate them and rough them up. Sometimes perform what they called urine therapy, where they dump a bucket of piss on their head, and put all this on a video on YouTube. And there was these have been wildly popular videos in YouTube. It's torture porn. So one guy out of this large network of men who are on tape torturing people, one guy has been arrested. That's it. Other people, there's some enforcement. The police in Volgograd have been making efforts to arrest some suspects, and a young man there came out to his friends. It's not even worth describing what they did. The most horrible things you can imagine. And the police arrested them. So, I mean, those kinds of sort of crossing the line, that there'll be some enforcement on. I mean, remember, this is in effect, it's a quiet police state, but it is still a police state.
Right.
I met a Cossack. We think of Cossacks as, of course, there's ethnic Cossacks, but Cossacks as a sort of military figures. We think of something out of Fiddler on the Roof. And here was this giant guy, dressed up like a 19th century Cossack, with the special Cossack whip, which has a sharp lead weight at the end, and a big knife, and on his hip a gun. Guns are very illegal in Russia, handguns like that. It was an illegal gun. And he's careful about how he uses it. But at the same time, we see what Putin has done nationally is he's reactivated the Cossacks. He has encouraged Cossacks to organize. He's encouraged states to organize Cossack militias. One state sort of provincial governor said, I'm deputizing sort of 1,000 Cossacks because the Cossacks can do what the police can't do, which means they can break the law, they can hurt, and they can pursue what this particular Cossack described as Cossack humor, which was so violent and grotesque that, again, I think I have to leave it out of our discussion.
But so some of these people you were saying that you called it torture porn, that it's online.
Yeah.
So it's, you're committing a crime, you're assaulting someone, and you've put evidence of this on the internet, and you get away with it.
A lot of people do. A lot of people do get away with it. That said, I would emphasize that as horrible as those incidents are, that's not where the real terror is. So you go to a big city like Moscow or St. Petersburg, there's not a lot of that level of violence. There is the ordinary terror of losing your children, of losing your
Right.
job, of losing everything.
Right.
And I think I think that's almost more important. There's been a lot of attention in the West paid to Occupy pedophilia. I didn't actually talk to those guys. I made a
Hmm.
half-hearted attempt to talk to Tasak, who was already on the run, because he knew he was going to be arrested. But I wasn't as interested in them. I was interested in, there's a sort of a level of ordinary thug that works both in the political sphere and in the sort of extra legal sphere. And I was interested in, as much as talking to activists and talking to regular queer couples, queer
Hmm.
folks trying to live ordinary lives under rapidly changing circumstances.
Well, you profile these two couples who lived across the hall from each other under this sort of charade that they were two straight couples, but they were actually not. So they had these two apartments
Yeah.
side by side so that they could carry on that charade.
Yeah, yeah. This was I'd been told about this arrangement, and I asked, and they were thinking of emigrating, and I wanted to speak to people who were thinking of emigrating, which turned out to be sort of almost everybody.
Hmm.
Um, and it was sort of difficult to get to speak to them because this guy, he was successful. His partner was successful. The two women who were officially their wives were successful.
Hmm.
They had a nice life for themselves. This guy, he grew up in a provincial city. When he was 13, he remembered the moment when he realized he was gay. And he said he was very, very calm, very level-headed person. He says, I remember thinking, I realized I was gay. I was tremendously relieved. I knew who I was. And I knew that as long as I knew who I was, I would find a way to fulfill my dream in life, which was to be a father. That's what he wanted to do. He found a woman who was his dear, dear friend, and they had a child together. His partner, the same. And as you say, they had these two apartments right next to each other. The girls think of both men as their fathers, both women as their mothers. They have to hide. They have no family pictures of their real family arrangements because there's a
Hmm.
nanny, and they keep that hidden. They hide on every level. Nobody knows. And until now, he accepted that, and he said that's the price. I have a good life, and I can live with that. And then comes the propaganda law, and that terrorizes him. And he's now had to teach his daughters not to call him, or one of his daughters, not to call him father. He says, "You can
Right.
never call me father again." And he says, even this I can handle, because if the law comes, they'll come for me. But there's another law that's coming. Everyone expects it will allow the state much more easily to take children away from gay parents.
Well, they've already outlawed foreign same-sex couples adopting Russian children, right?
Yes, but this will be and that's terrible. But this will be a much much bigger
Much more
step. This
terrible. Right,
is this
right.
is this is
But
where
it's
it really gets
progressive. I
into
mean,
sort of
this
Orwellian
is
depths.
right. These are steps that they're taking that are going to get increasingly scary.
Yeah, and again,
Um,
you don't know how will they really enforce them. There's a lesbian couple who had a child, and they lived next door to a straight couple with a child. Their kids played together. They considered them friends. Everything was wonderful. Um, until the propaganda law passed, at which point the straight couple decided that they needed some extra money. And so they decided to start blackmailing the lesbian couple.
oh
Pay
my
us,
God.
or we will report you for propagandizing your own child. Uh, and that couple has decided to go into court to fight it, and they're trying to make it a test case. And back in December, they wanted to make it a test case before Sochi, when the world was looking, and unfortunately, it's been moving slowly.
So speaking of Sochi, do you think that the Olympics being in Russia will draw more attention to this or less? Because people will be so focused on the Olympics and the hype and the pageantry and all of that that it will cause news media in particular to sort of gloss over all of this? Or do you think that this is an opportunity to get the world to recognize that this is happening there?
I think it's a very limited opportunity. I mean, I think the reality is you and I wouldn't be speaking about this if it wasn't for the Olympics. I know that GQ, which put a lot of resources into this story, they knew what they were doing. They knew that if they could get this out in the February issue before the Olympics, then people were going to be paying attention. And you talk to every sort of activist over there, even ordinary people, they understand that they are living in this strange window, a window of opportunity in which they can get their situation out to the world. And I think then you speak to some of these right-wing guys, and they also realize this, but they say after the Olympics, a war is coming. I mean, this meeting that I talk about attending in the story, sort of a league of evil super friends. I mean, there's a representative from the Cossacks, there's a representative from several right-wing veterans groups, there's a representative of angry babushkas who throw stones, there was a representative of violent Orthodox activists. Everybody was there. The World Congress of Families was there. They said, we're gathering because we haven't really started. We're gathering to discuss new, stronger measures. We're gathering to discuss the war that is to come. And they know that that's coming after the Olympics, when the attention turns away, unless, I think, these Russian activists can succeed and getting the whole world's eyes on Russia. That's of limited use because, we've seen again and again and again that Putin's not too worried about that. But all we can do is our best. And I think there's been some discussion of people saying, well, really, let's just let the Russians handle it, and we're just making it worse. I didn't meet a single activist who believed that. Some of them said, yes, we're going to handle this ourselves. We're going to do the fighting. But there's no one saying, turn away, ignore us, pretend this isn't happening.
So do you think, I mean, I know that people talked about boycotting Sochi, but that kind of fizzled. I mean, I'm not even sure something like that would have been effective for addressing this, but I don't know. I mean, what do you think about?
Well, I mean, it's a dead letter. It's not going to happen.
Right.
So,
but if it had, hypothetically,
I don't know. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do in this story, and one of the things that I thought was really fascinating, is that there's a spectrum of LGBT political life in Russia. Of course, there's always a spectrum of all kinds of life, but and it can even almost be divided between the two big cities. Not perfectly, but St. Petersburg is where you have a lot of these great organizations like Coming Out. St. Petersburg are headquartered, and these are the organizations that they do education, they do support groups. They look a lot more like what sort of Western LGBT rights groups today look like. Moscow looks a little bit more like Stonewall. There you have much more radical groups. You also have, again, this is not an exact divide. You have sort of more radical groups who are really ready to meet people in the streets, to get out there. They are putting their bodies on the line. Of course, anyone who's an activist in Russia right now is putting their body on the line. So, I mean, this is a spectrum, and which way is the right way? I don't know. And one thing I thought was promising, almost none of the activists I spoke to was willing to say our way is the right way and not that way. They say, look,
whatever works.
We're in a fight. Well, not only whatever works. Right now, nothing's particularly working very well. Right. But we're in a fight for our lives. So however you want to fight, and maybe you want to fight just by living your life, then we support you. But there is that divide, and that divide played out between those who said, yes, let's boycott Sochi. No, that would just make things worse. And I think at this point, we have to move on from that question, because whether it was a good idea or not, it's not going to happen.
Well, listen, thank you so much for doing the story and for talking with me about it.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. Take care, Jeff.
Bye.